Pop Quiz. For the last 3 years, Jack has been using Anki to study Japanese. Every day he adds 10 new cards and does all of his reviews. He uses default Anki settings and maintains a consistent retention rate of 90%. Jack usually has around 100 reviews each day. If Jack continued his current Anki routine for an additional 15 years, his average number of reps per day would be A. Around 100, B. Around 150, C. Around 200. So the correct answer is actually C, 200 reviews a day. And so yes, contrary to popular explanations of how Anki works, as long as you keep adding new cards each day, your average number of reviews each day will continue to climb. It never reaches some sort of point where it just levels out and then stays at a constant rate, even if you're adding the same number of new cards every single day. Now, it is true that as you add more and more cards, the rate at which your average number of reviews per day grows will slow down. But at the end of the day, as long as you keep adding cards, the average number of reviews you have each day will continue to grow. And if you want to confirm this for yourself, you can try it out on the Anki simulator that one of my patrons helped create for me that I'm going to link in the description. And so if in the long run, continuing to add Anki cards means that our daily number of reviews is going to continue to grow, this means that treating all of our Anki cards as permanent fixtures of our life is simply not sustainable. It means that sooner or later we're going to have to start purging our Anki cards, and this is where the question arises, when's the right time to get rid of an Anki card? Well, in the context of language learning, answering this question is actually extremely simple. The right time to get rid of an Anki card is as soon as you stop needing it. Basically, if you make an Anki card to help you learn a certain word, then as soon as you reach the point of knowing that word well enough for immersion alone to be enough to maintain your knowledge of that word, then the original SRS card you made to learn the word becomes completely unnecessary. So let's try to explore this idea a little bit more deeply. So in order to really think about when the right time to get rid of an Anki card is, we probably want to start by thinking about what Anki cards are actually good for in the first place. So in my last video, I talked about how, in my view, the real role of the SRS within the big picture of learning a language is to help you very efficiently create and maintain mental dictionary entries for words. So basically the job of an SRS card is to help you remember, first of all, that a word exists, and then also what the word looks like and sounds like, and then also roughly what it means. And knowing this helps you learn from your immersion much more efficiently. So when we think about it this way, we can realize that we don't have to necessarily wait until we have fully acquired a word in order to get rid of our SRS card for it, right? It means that as long as we know the word well enough for immersion alone to keep the mental dictionary entry intact, then at that point, continuing to review the SRS card is going to be a waste of time. So in that case, let's try to really think about when exactly that point will be where a dictionary entry is strong enough for us to stop needing an SRS card to maintain it. And in order to think about that, we're going to have to just explore how human memory works in general a little bit. So the basic model of human memory that SRS algorithms are based on assumes that every piece of information in your memory comes with a sort of built-in expiration date. And so if you don't review a memory before its expiration date, then you end up forgetting it. And so in theory, it could even be possible to forget things like your own name or your birthday if only your lifespan was long enough and you went long enough without remembering what your name was or thinking about when your birthday was. So the other side of this is that if you do review a memory before you forget it, then its expiration date is kind of reset and you actually become able to remember that memory for longer than you were able to before. And so spaced repetition systems like Anki use an algorithm to predict the expiration dates of your memories so that it can help you review those memories before they expire and therefore help you strengthen your memories very efficiently. So let's just establish some basic terminology real quick in order to help us really think about how this process unfolds. So first of all, because we're talking about language learning, just for the sake of keeping things simple, I'm going to be talking about things in terms of remembering words. And when I say remembering a word, what I really mean is remembering that a word exists, remembering what that word looks like and sounds like, and remembering roughly what that word means. Okay, so let's call the amount of time it takes for a word to be forgotten a word's internal interval. Internal because it's dependent on your brain. So for example, if your internal interval of the Japanese word neko was 9 months, that would mean that it would take you 9 months of not reviewing that word in order for you to forget it. So now on the other hand, let's call how often you see a given SRS card for a word the SRS interval. So for example, if your SRS interval for your card for the word nickel was 4 months, it would mean that you see that SRS card once every 4 months. So using this terminology, for a given word that you have an SRS card for, as long as your internal interval is longer than the SRS interval, then assuming that you actually do your reps every day, you're never going to forget the word. So for example, if it would take you 9 months of not reviewing to forget the word nickel, but the SRS shows you your card for the word nickel once every 4 months, then you're never going to forget the word. Now, in reality, things are going to be a little bit more complicated than this because both your internal intervals and your SRS intervals are not going to be remaining in a static state. As you continue to review, they're both going to continue to grow exponentially over time. But this doesn't change the basic principle that at any one given point in time, the internal interval for a word must always be longer than the SRS interval. But if you're taking an immersion-based approach to acquiring a language, then the SRS is not the only place that you come across words, right? Whenever you're reading, watching, or listening to something in your target language, and you come across a word that you know and remember what that word means, you're essentially repping that word, which is going to therefore reset and expand your internal interval for that word. Okay, last piece of terminology. Let's call the average rate at which you come across a given word in your immersion, given your current immersion diet, a word's organic interval. So for example, let's say that you're studying Japanese, and given the type of Japanese content that you immerse with and the frequency with which you immerse in it, on average, you come across the word neko around once a week. So if it would take you 9 months of not reviewing in order to forget the word neko, yet on average you come across it around once a week, then as long as you keep up your current immersion diet, you're never going to forget the word, regardless of whether you have an SRS card for it or not. So really, once your internal interval for a word exceeds the organic interval, then right at that second, you stop needing an SRS card in order to maintain your mental dictionary entry for that word. So in my last video, I talked about how the role of the SRS is to help you very efficiently create and maintain mental dictionary entries for words. But really, this isn't the full story because the SRS allows you to do more than just maintain memories in a static way, right? It actually helps you gradually strengthen your memories over time until they actually get to the point where they can maintain themselves just through immersion with no work on your part. I think a good analogy for understanding this idea is that of launching a satellite up into Earth's gravitational orbit. So if us humans here on Earth want to put a satellite up into space, then we have to attach a big rocket to it, which is going to exert a huge amount of force in order to get that satellite up high enough to break through Earth's atmosphere and enter Earth's gravitational orbit. But once it has broken into Earth's gravitational orbit, then gravity alone is going to keep it rotating around the Earth right where we want it to without any extra work on our part as humans. And so in the same way, when you first create a mental dictionary entry for a word, it takes some work on your part through SRSing in order to help build up the internal interval for that word until it eventually gets strong enough to surpass the organic interval, at which point it gets sucked into the gravitational force of immersion and then maintains itself automatically without any work on your part. So again, just to reiterate, the true role of the SRS is to allow you to, first of all, very efficiently create and maintain mental dictionary entries, but also to allow you to very efficiently strengthen these mental dictionary entries until they reach the point of being able to sustain themselves completely automatically. Now really, I'm sure that this is all pretty intuitive because after all, almost no one uses an SRS for their native language, yet people seem to be able to maintain their native language no problem, right? And this isn't because it's impossible to forget your native language, because there actually are examples of people not using their native language for a number of decades and forgetting their native language to large degrees. It's just because we get constant immersion in our native language, and that alone is enough to maintain our ability. So far I've talked about how SRS cards are not permanent fixtures. They're really just a kind of temporary measure that help you get your internal interval for a word to surpass the organic interval. And actually, once you hit this point with a certain word, then any extra time you spend reviewing that word in the SRS is being wasted, because that's also time that you could be spending either learning more new words or getting more immersion. And this is why Yoga and I have created the retirement add-on for Anki. So what the retirement add-on does is it allows you to set a retiring interval for each of your Anki decks, and then once the cards in each of your decks reach that interval, then the add-on will automatically either delete them or suspend them or move them to another deck, depending on what you set in the add-on settings. So the reason why we decided to call it retirement when a card becomes unnecessary and is removed from your deck is that Anki already has the concept of graduation. A card's graduating interval is the interval that it starts off with after moving from the learning queue to the review queue. So if cards already graduate, then we thought that it would make sense for them to also go on to retire as well, kind of creating this theme of cards being something that have a complete life cycle. So I already have a video where I explain all of the actual technicalities of setting up and using the add-on, so in this video I'm just going to be focusing on the actual theoretical logic behind the retirement add-on. So the idea is, you start off by thinking, given your current level and immersion diet, what is the organic interval likely to be for most of the words that you're currently learning? So for example, if you're a beginner in a language, then the words that you're going to be learning are going to be extremely common, and so we could probably make the extremely conservative estimate that all the words that you're learning are going to have an organic interval of less than 3 months. And again, the reason why this would be so conservative is because if you're learning extremely common words and doing any amount of immersion at all, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to go 3 whole months without seeing each of these words at least once in your immersion. And again, if the words you're learning have an organic interval of less than 3 months, then that means that as long as your internal interval for any one of these words surpasses 3 months, then you're going to be able to continue to remember it even without an Anki card. So then, if we think of a card's SRS interval as a kind of rough approximation of our internal interval for the word, and in fact this would be quite a conservative approximation since in general, like I explained earlier in the video, our internal intervals are going to be longer than our SRS intervals, then it would totally make sense to tell Anki to retire cards after a card's interval surpasses 3 months, because that would mean that at that point it's extremely likely that our internal interval for the word will have already surpassed the organic interval, meaning that we no longer need a card to continue to remember the word. And then by removing all of these unnecessary cards, we're now getting time back that would have been wasted on unnecessary reps. Now, inevitably, there are going to be some times where a card is retired in Anki, and then we actually go on to end up forgetting that word. And there are actually 2 different potential causes for this. First of all, it's possible that for a given word, your SRS interval actually ended up being larger than your internal interval. In Anki, if you have a 90% retention rate, what that really means is that 10% of the time, you end up forgetting something that Anki thinks that you should still know. So what does this really mean for our situation? Well, let's just say, for example, that you set a retiring interval of 3 months or 90 days. So one day you're doing your reviews, and then a card which you haven't seen for 40 days comes up. You still remember the card and you graded good, and so then Anki assigns that card a new interval of 100 days, and the card gets retired. Now, if you had a 90% retention rate in Anki, then this would mean that you now have a 90% chance of remembering this word 100 days from now. And so in that case, what that would mean for us is that because the card has been retired, we now have at least 100 days to come across this word in our immersion and refresh our memory so that we don't forget it. Now, on the other hand, a 90% retention rate also means that there's a 10% chance that we will forget this word within the next 100 days. And this potentially opens us up to the possibility of forgetting the word before we have an opportunity to come across it again in our immersion. Now, I don't want to get too deep into math here, but in this specific case, the probability that we would actually forget the word before coming across it in our immersion is actually much less than 10%. And the reason for this is that all that 10% is telling us is that there's a 10% chance that we're going to forget the word sometime within the next 100 days. It doesn't actually tell us anything about when we would forget it within those 100 days. So perhaps we forget it after 50 days, maybe we forget it after 70 days or after 90 days. And so chances are, even if we would end up forgetting the word within the next 100 days, we still remember it long enough to happen to come across it again in our immersion and end up maintaining the memory. And so really, the probability of you forgetting a word for a card that's been retired because Anki messed up its intervals is extremely slim. Although, of course, every once in a while, something is going to fall through the cracks, and it is going to happen. But ultimately, I don't really think that this is something to worry about, because at the end of the day, memory and the SRS is all a probability game. And so the way that you should think about it is that if forgetting one word here and there allows you to learn 5 words in its place, that is a trade that you want to make. And I really think that's what's going on here with the retirement add-on. Okay, so I just explained the first potential cause of forgetting a word after a card gets retired, which was Anki will occasionally overshoot its intervals and retire a card prematurely. But the other, much more common potential cause of forgetting a word after a card gets retired is in the case where you happen to learn a word which is quite rare, or in other words, a word whose organic interval is unusually large compared to all the other words that you're currently learning. So this should be, for the most part, pretty self-explanatory, right? If you learn a word that's a lot rarer than all the other words that you have been learning, then even after the card for that word gets retired, there's a good chance that you won't see it often enough in your immersion to be able to retain your memory of that word. Now, actually, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because if you've set a reasonable retiring interval relative to your current level and immersion diet, then if a word which you had a retired card for isn't showing up often enough in your immersion for you to be able to retain it, then at your current level, you probably didn't need to know that word in the first place. And not only did you probably not need to know that word, but chances are, even if you weren't using the retirement add-on, you wouldn't have been very successful at learning that word anyway. And the reason for this is that, like I talked about in my last video, as the intervals on your SRS cards get bigger and bigger, there's this strong tendency for your memories to get blurrier and blurrier. So even without using the retirement add-on, you aren't likely to be successful in using the SRS to learn words with excessively large organic intervals relative to your current level and immersion diet. And so in this way, the retirement add-on can also play the function of helping to weed out all the cards which you probably shouldn't have added in the first place. So on that note, let's explore what some of the potential benefits might be of using the retirement add-on. So first of all, we have the very practical benefit of wasting less time while SRSing. So, as I've been saying over and over throughout this video, once you reach the point where immersion alone is enough to maintain your memory for a word, then any additional time you spend reviewing that word in the SRS is not bringing you any benefit. But a lot of you guys out there might be thinking, repping a single SRS card only takes a few seconds, so it's probably not going to make any real difference. But when you really think about it, in the long run, all of this time spent doing unnecessary reviews is going to add up. So let's just say that on average, you're doing 15 unnecessary reps each day. And this is actually a very plausible number if you go and play around with the Anki simulator and mess around with different potential retiring intervals. So if you're doing 15 unnecessary reps each day, and on average you spend 20 seconds on each rep, then that means that you're wasting 5 minutes a day on unnecessary reviews. And so 5 minutes a day means that you're spending 30 hours a year on unnecessary reviews. So that's over an entire day that you could be spending on either actually learning new words or just getting more immersion, but instead you're just wasting doing Anki reviews that aren't bringing you any benefit. Now, in addition to this very practical benefit of using the retirement add-on, I actually think that there are a couple potential psychological benefits as well. And in fact, I actually think that these might prove to be more valuable than the practical benefit for a lot of people. And what I mean by this is that a lot of people, myself included, have had a very difficult time maintaining the right type of relationship with the SRS. For example, in my case, I know that when I first started using Anki, I quickly noticed that whatever I made an Anki card for, I would tend to remember pretty well. And over time, this slowly kind of developed into this distrust of my own memory, where I started to feel like if I didn't make an Anki card for something, then I definitely would forget it. And this led to a lot of bad things. Like, first of all, I started to make way too many cards for things that I didn't need to make cards for, because I felt like if I didn't make a card for it, I'd forget it. And also because I started to view the SRS as this kind of safe vault for my memory, where anything that I made a card for, I would definitely remember for all of eternity. That led to me being a kind of perfectionist about my cards, because since I was going to have these cards forever and they were going to be the thing that would make sure I never forgot something, then I wanted my cards to be perfect. I wanted to have the perfect sentence. I wanted to have the perfect definition. I had to make sure that I understood it completely perfectly. And this led me to be pretty OCD about card making and reviewing my cards. And that was just a lot of wasted time and a lot of stress that wasn't really doing anything for me. And probably worst of all, because I had this relationship with the SRS, I started to feel like, oh, I can slack on my immersion every now and again, because as long as I continue to do my SRS reviews, then I won't backslide. I won't forget anything. And this is true to a certain extent, but you really don't want to think about immersion this way, because immersion is really the thing that leads to your progress. The SRS is ultimately just a supplement. And so I think that if I had something like the retirement add-on this whole time, then I would have been forced to develop the right type of relationship with the SRS. First of all, I would have never started to distrust my memory, because I would see that really I was still able to remember things even after my cards would get deleted. And also because my cards would get deleted every few months, there would have been no point in trying to be a perfectionist about the cards that I made. And also, I would have never had the idea that it would be okay to slack on immersion as long as I did the SRS, because a lot of my knowledge would have already already retired in the SRS, and it would be up to my own immersion in order to maintain that knowledge. And most of all, I think there's just something really daunting about the SRS being something that continues forever. You're just reviewing these cards forever and ever and ever until you die, because otherwise you might forget them. But now, if you're using the retirement add-on, there's actually an end to the SRS. A card has a birth and a death, and so you can continue to rep them until you have no more reps left and you never have to use the SRS again. And I think that this kind of makes your whole relationship with the SRS much more light and much less stressful and daunting. So originally, I was actually planning on going pretty deeply into all my thoughts behind what you should set your retiring interval to, depending on what your current level is and what your immersion diet is. But this video has already gotten so long, I think I'm just going to end it here. I'll be talking about that either in a blog post or a future video very soon. And so, yeah, if you've watched this far in the video, thank you so much. I'm really trying to get better at making shorter videos. I always think the video is going to be short, and then by the time I finish writing the script, it's giant. And even if I shave some of the video off, it's still giant. I'm trying to get better at that. I know that it would be easier to make shorter videos. It's easier to watch shorter videos. But anyway, here we are. So if you'd like to use the retirement add-on, it's on Anki Web for free, and it's also on GitHub. There'll be links in the description. Thank you so much to our patrons at Mass Immersion Approach. If it wasn't for all the patrons supporting us, we wouldn't have been able to develop this add-on. Shout out to Yoga. He's the one who actually coded the add-on, and we came up with the ideas together. If you'd like to get early access to beta release of add-ons we make in the future, come check out our Patreon. And that's it. So thanks a lot, guys. See you next time.